And this happened last summer when my family went on vacation to Maui. It was supposed to be a relaxing day, snorkeling with my wife and our 17-year-old son. We'd done it before, and the conditions were ideal. There were clear skies, calm waters, and good visibility. Nothing about it felt unsafe at the time. That's probably what scares me the most now. How fast something can go from peaceful to life-threatening without a warning. We parked at this beach that was known for its coral reefs and sea turtles. We rented some gear, found a less crowded part of the beach, and got into the water. My wife went ahead. She's always been a strong swimmer and prefers to dive down and free swim. I stayed back with my son, who was just easing into the water, adjusting his mask and his snorkel. We were probably 20 or 30 yards from shore when I noticed my wife had already gotten out pretty far, maybe 50 yards. My son and I were still paddling slowly, just checking out fish near the rocks and getting used to the water temperature. It was calm, nothing out of the ordinary. Then, out of nowhere, I felt something shove me hard from behind. I thought it was a wave or someone kicking off of me, but when I came up, it was my son. He had this wild look in his eyes and was breathing hard, clutching at me like his life depended on it. I did not understand what was happening at first. I thought maybe he saw something in the water that scared him. Then I realized he had taken in water through his snorkel and was in full-on panic mode. He's bigger than I am, 6'2", solid, and he was holding onto me like I was a flotation device. It took me a second to register what was happening, and by then I was already being pushed underwater. My mask flooded, and my snorkel filled with water, so I had to rip them off just to breathe. I came up coughing and trying to tread water, while also holding up my son, who would not let go. In theory, we were only about 40 yards from shore. In reality, it felt like a mile. I tried to keep us both afloat, but I was quickly burning out. Every time I tried to talk to him and tell him to float or kick, he just squeezed harder. Well, his panic was making him dead weight. I was dipping below the surface more and more often, each time taking in a bit more water. My legs were cramping up. I started thinking, this is how it happens. This is how people drown. I honestly thought we were both going to die. I knew that if I let go of him, he might go under, but if I didn't, we both would. I started yelling for help. At first, no one heard me. Everyone was spaced out, heads in the water. I kept screaming until finally I saw someone turn their head. A guy on a paddleboard started making his way over. Then 2 other snorkelers followed. By the time they reached us, I was at the edge. My arms and legs were toast. I could barely stay above water. The guy on the paddleboard got my son up onto it, and the moment his weight was off of me, I just went limp and floated on my back, barely paddling, trying to catch my breath. Another guy grabbed my hand and helped guide me toward a nearby boat. I don't remember getting on it. I just remember laying there, shaking, chest heaving, completely wiped out. It wasn't until we were all safely back on shore that I processed what had just happened. I sat there on the sand next to my son, who still looked shell-shocked, and neither of us said much for a while. He apologized later, said he did not know what came over him. I told him there was nothing to be sorry for. Panic takes over. He did not do anything wrong. But it scared the hell out of me how little time it took to get to that point. I mean, we're both good swimmers. That's the part that messed with my head afterward. If he hadn't panicked, he probably could have spit out the snorkel, swam to shore, and been fine. and I would have never been in danger either. But when you're in a state of panic, nothing makes sense. And when someone's panicking in the water, they can and will take you down with them. It's not their fault. It's just what happens. And trust me, I've gone over that day in my head more times than I can count. Could I have handled it differently? Should I have told him what to do? Or tried to push him off and risk the guilt if something happened? I still don't know. But I do know that if those people hadn't come when they did, I probably wouldn't be here writing this to you, and I wouldn't have my son. That was the closest I've ever come to dying. There were no monsters, no ghosts, no creepy strangers. Just a clear, sunny day in summertime that almost killed me. In the summer of 1995, I spent several weeks studying in Europe. It was my first time out of the country, and I was 21, traveling on a tight college budget. Once my program ended, I had 1 week to explore solo before heading back home. I had what they called a Eurorail pass, and stretched every cent I had to make the most of it. On one of my last days, I found out this pass included a free cruise on Lake Geneva. I figured it would be a relaxing way to spend an afternoon before catching my overnight train later that evening. Well, the cruise was longer than I expected, about 2.5 hours total. It was a hot day that day, almost uncomfortably so. The sun was beating down on the deck, so I kept rotating between sitting outside for the view and moving inside to cool off. I did not think much of it until the third or fourth time I switched spots and realized I wasn't alone in doing this. There was also a man and a woman, probably in their mid to late 30s at the time, who I had vaguely noticed before but hadn't paid much attention to. They weren't together in the typical sense. They didn't talk, didn't sit next to each other, but I started noticing that every time I changed locations, they'd follow. Not at the same time, but within a minute or two, like they were watching to see where I go. At first, I tried to brush it off. I figured maybe I was overthinking, or maybe the seats I was picking just happened to be where they wanted to sit too. But the longer it went on, the more obvious it became to me. I moved inside. 10 minutes later, the man came in and sat a few rows behind me. Then the woman came in and sat across the aisle. Then I go back outside, same thing. They never approached me or said anything, but they always positioned themselves within a few feet. They never looked like they were together, but I could feel that they were, if that makes sense. I tried to test it by moving more frequently and choosing less desirable seats, places that weren't in the shade or did not have a good view, and they still followed. At this point, the boat was quiet. Most of the other tourists had disembarked at earlier stops around the lake. By the time we were pulling into the final dock, it was just 3 of us left there. That's when my stomach dropped. I realized if something were to happen to me, no one would know until it was way too late. I had no cell phone, and the only plan my parents had was to pick me up at the airport in 5 days. That was it. No one knew my location or my itinerary, so I made a snap decision to just stay seated and let the other 2 disembark first. The woman stood up and walked off, and the man followed shortly after. But when I stepped off the ramp a minute later, I saw them still lingering nearby, not walking off in the opposite directions like strangers, not heading toward a taxi or a bus, just standing there. That's when I saw a police officer at the end of the dock. I walked straight over to him and pretended I had a question about train schedules. I stood there next to him for a few minutes, pretending to casually read a nearby sign, while the couple stayed put about 30 feet away. It was like they were waiting to see if I'd go off on my own again. Eventually, after maybe 5 or 10 minutes, they walked off together in the same direction. I stood by that officer for a while longer just to be sure. When I finally felt comfortable enough to move, I made my way to the train station and sat in the waiting area. I had about 6 hours until my train was scheduled to leave, but I figured staying around other people was safer than wandering around the city, especially now that I was feeling shaken up. And I never reported anything. There wasn't technically a crime, but I knew in my gut that something wasn't right that day. I think about it sometimes even now, decades later. What if I hadn't noticed them? What if I had disembarked alone and wandered off toward a side street or a park like I originally planned to? What if that officer hadn't been there? I mean, I have no idea what they were planning. Maybe they thought I was an easy target. Maybe it was for money, a passport, or something worse. I'll never know. But I don't doubt for a second that something would have happened if I hadn't stayed alert. That trip changed how I travel. I'm much more careful now, more aware of my surroundings, and more deliberate in how I move around. I always tell someone where I'm going, even if it's just for the day. Back then, I thought I was just being smart with my money. Now I know I was also lucky. Hey, so I figured I'd share something from my childhood that stuck with me for decades. Now, it's not bloody or violent, but it creeped my whole family out. And to this day, we've never been able to explain it. I'm in my late 40s now, but this happened in the early 80s, when I was around 7. It was one of those moments that seemed small at first, but just kept getting weirder. Every summer, my parents took us to Wildwood, New Jersey. It was our tradition. We always stayed at the same beachfront motel. It was nothing fancy, but it was clean, family-friendly, and well-run. We knew the layout well. Our room had a small living area with a couch and kitchenette, a hallway with a bathroom off of it, and a bedroom at the end with 2 beds. Now, that particular summer, everything started fine. We checked in on a Saturday, unpacked, went to the boardwalk, and got pizza. I remember that first night because I couldn't sleep from all the excitement. We had a great day. The next morning, my mom noticed the front door to the room was cracked open. Not wide open, just slightly ajar. We always lock up tight, and that night we used the regular lock, the deadbolt, and the chain. My parents assumed one of us had fiddled with it during the night, or maybe my sister had tried to open it in her sleep. Still, it was weird. So that night, they made a point to double-check everything before bed. Both kids were asleep by 9 p.m., and my parents slept on the outside edge of each bed. My dad with me, and my mom with my sister, to make sure we wouldn't wander off or do anything strange in our sleep. We were all inside the bedroom, and the front door was all the way on the other side of the suite. The next morning, same thing. The door was cracked open again. The deadbolt unlocked, chain hanging, door not wide open, but just slightly pushed out. This time, my dad was unsettled. He went down to the front office and asked to speak with the manager. The guy apologized, said they were fully booked and couldn't move us, but offered a partial refund for the week and said maintenance would look at the door. Later that day, they said everything worked fine. Nothing was broken. Well, that only made it weirder. That night, my dad put all of our luggage against the front door. 4 suitcases and a duffel bag, stacked to make noise if someone tried to push in. It wasn't too heavy, but definitely enough that no one could get through without making a racket. Well, we all went to bed again, doors locked tight, same routine. Next morning, the door was opened again, and not fully, just enough to notice. But what really messed us up was the luggage. It had been moved into the living room. It wasn't knocked over or scattered around. It had been placed there. One bag was sitting neatly on the coffee table. Nobody heard a thing. My parents were wide awake by then. They tried to stay calm, but I remember them whispering that morning in the kitchen. That was the first time I realized that they were scared too. But we still didn't leave the motel. And looking back, that part's hard to explain. My parents did not want to panic the kids. It was our only vacation, and we had 4 more days to go. They probably did not want to believe it was something dangerous, so they tried one more thing. That night, my dad dragged the kitchen table on this old, heavy wooden thing across the room and wedged it directly in front of the door. He also set up a couple of chairs on top of it. We all went to bed early that night. He did not sleep much, I could tell. When we woke up, the door was opened again, and the table, back in its place, centered in the kitchenette, chairs tucked underneath of it. Not a single sound all night. No one saw or heard anything. Nothing in the room was missing. Nothing else moved. It was like someone was toying with us. We stayed the rest of the week, but I don't remember much after that. My parents tried to keep the rest of the trip fun, but even at that age, I knew that there was something wrong. They never figured it out. They asked the hotel again, but the staff swore up and down that no employees had keys to rooms except for emergencies, and that no one would have entered without our knowledge. Years later, I brought it up to my mom and dad again. My dad still insists that it wasn't one of us. He even admitted he stayed up half the night that last night, and still did not hear a thing. He's not the type to believe in ghosts or anything like that, but when I asked him what he thought it was, he just said, "I don't know, but something wasn't right." We never stayed in that motel again.